Hi, everyone. My name's Alice Charles from the World Economic Forum. And today we're going to have a wonderful discussion around the whole issue of migration and how it relates to cities in terms of looking at the impacts it has on cities, on urban infrastructure, on services. And we're also going to look at how it impacts on community cohesion. And the big piece is we're going to look at the solutions that are enabled by technology, et cetera, and then we'll try and sum up. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists this afternoon. We're absolutely delighted to have the UN representative with Emel Muedin. And Amy is at the office of the UN Secretary General's Special Representative on the issue of international migration, and she's a migration policy advisor there. So Amy, would you like to come on out? So our next representative is from the city of Los Angeles, and we have Linda Lopez, who's the chief of the Office of Immigrant Affairs and a senior policy advisor at the city of Los Angeles. So we'll have a city perspective. Thank you, Linda. Okay. And our next representative is from MasterCard. It's great to have a private sector voice in the panel. We have Antonia Stroeh, who's the Senior Vice President for Government and Development from MasterCard. Thank you, Antonia. And our next representative is from a wonderful project which is right here in New York City. We have Dakota Gruener, who's the Executive Director of ID 2020. So welcome, Antonia.
Thank you.
So just in terms of format, what we're going to do today is I will broadly introduce the issue of migration and its impact on cities, and then I'm going to open it to our panelists. We're going to talk, first of all, about the UN Global Compact on migration and refugees, which is currently in development at the moment, and how that relates to cities. We're going to hear from the city perspective about what's actually happening in the city of Los Angeles in relation to migration. And we're going to hear the private sector perspective. So why is a company like MasterCard involved in this piece? And finally, we're going to hear all about the ID 2020 project. So just to put it into context, today we have 1 billion people who are classified as migrants. So that's 1/7 of the world's population is on the move in some shape or form. And that level of human mobility is certainly unprecedented. And if we try to break that down, according to the United Nations, 258 million people are international migrants. So they're going from one country to another. And 763 million are internal migrants who are moving from one part of a country to another. Now, it's fair to say in terms of the statistics that most of those internal movements are happening within just 3 countries. And that's India, China, and Brazil, for example. But when these people move, whether it's international migration or internal migration, by and large, they end up in cities. So why do people move to cities? They move to cities in search of a better quality of life, better urban infrastructure and services, economic opportunity, et cetera. And if we talk about the number of people, for example, who are foreign-born citizens who are living within some of our cities in the world, the number can be as high as 83%, according to the International Office on Migration in the city of Dubai, but Dubai actually believes it's 91%. And cities like Brussels has around 62%. And then there are a number of cities, the larger cities like Los Angeles and New York, that, for example, Los Angeles is around 39%, and Linda can clarify if that's correct according to IOM. And New York has around 37%. So that's sort of the norm in the 30s for very, very large cities. And I guess what informed this discussion today was we at the World Economic Forum did a major study, a major deep dive on migration earlier this year. And that focused on the impacts of migration in terms of urban infrastructure and services, community cohesion, and it focused on the solutions that cities are employing. And it told the story of 22 cities from around the world who are the most affected by migration. And finally, it looked at how you could try to prepare for this scenario. So within that, there was 4 critical challenges that cities cited that they were trying to deal with. the number one challenge was the provision of affordable housing. So 20 out of 22 cities said the number one challenge they faced was the provision of affordable housing. Also, cities cited major challenges in terms of the provision of education, and that was because there was additional numbers, for example, going to primary schools, secondary schools. There was also major language barriers, trying to teach students in English who may not teach English. And also cities cited issues with trying to get migrant entrepreneurship programs off the ground. So trying to get employment for people was a major issue. Another thing that was cited was an issue around trying to provide medical services to people. That was both physical medical services as well as mental health medical services. And the mental health piece often related to involuntary migrants who were coming from war-torn countries and had to leave their country against their will. So they're all pieces that the city is trying to deal with, as well as the whole issue of social cohesion and integration, which we'll come on to next. So I guess if we think about all of these challenges that cities are facing, and we also think about what's happening in terms of the global dialogue on the issue of migration, the UN is currently working on its global compacts on both international migration and refugees. So now is the time for cities to be able to activate their networks and contribute to this process and cite the impacts that migration is having on their cities and the solutions that they're employing. So I think now is the opportune time to ask Amy to just tell us a little bit more about the UN Global Compacts on migration and refugees, the position of member states, and how it relates to cities.
Great. Thanks very much, Alice. And I'm really happy to be here on behalf of the UN's Office for Migration, the Special Representative of the Secretary General. Maybe I'll just take a step back and recall that in September 2016, the UN General Assembly adopted what's called the New York Declaration, which addressed large movements of refugees and migrants. And born out of that process was a commitment that there would be a global compact for refugees and a separate global compact for migration, for facilitating safe, orderly, and regular migration. Now, the Refugee Compact, I'm not going to talk about so much, mainly because our office doesn't necessarily work on that specific process, but it rests on the 1951 Refugee Convention, its 67 protocol, and it's undergoing a number of consultations in Geneva, headed by the UN Refugee Agency there. But the Global Compact for Migration is undergoing a completely different negotiating process here in New York at UN headquarters, where the member states of the UN General Assembly are negotiating this type of text and what it would look like. And the reason for that is because there's really no prior international legal instrument that deals solely with migration. So this is really the first time that the UN is trying to formulate some type of global policy on migration. And the process for this began in February, where they began to negotiate this text. They should finish their negotiations by July and then adopt this text in a major head of state and government conference to occur in Marrakesh later this year. And you can actually find the draft text online to see what it's like. It's on the website refugeesmigrants.un.org, but I can quickly explain what the text looks like so far. So far, it has a number of guiding principles to govern it, issues such as being people-centered, human rights-focused, while emphasizing state sovereignty. It also has, for now, 22 objectives, which are really trying to take into account the entire migration cycle. For example, tracking patterns and trends on migrations globally, what to do about border management, how to combat trafficking and smuggling in people, how to best integrate migrants into host societies, and how to combat discrimination and this kind of negative, toxic narrative we hear a lot about migration. And so far, what we're seeing in terms of the negotiations is that, in general, there is a lot of strong support from the membership to engage on this multilateral level to give effect to promoting what's safe, orderly, and regular migration. And let me clarify that in UN jargon, regular migration does not mean frequent, it means not illegal. because in the UN, we don't qualify migrants as being illegal human beings, while the action of that movement, that's through undocumented means, we qualify that as irregular rather than through illegal. So while there is strong multilateral support for this, there is also a lot of strong emphasis on underlining state sovereignty, that it's ultimately up to each state to decide what their migration policy should be, which is of course true, but once you deal with the movement of people from one country to another, you are actually engaging in a lot more state interdependence. Now, despite this, we have a couple of country outliers. I mean, for the United States, for example, very publicly last December pulled itself out of the negotiations. And Hungary, while continuing to engage in the negotiations, has been very upfront about the need to stop migration and to say that migrants and migration itself do not contribute to countries. Other than that, there are two major issues that have been coming out of the text so far, and one is what to do with irregular migrants. For example, the use of firewalls or providing access to services to irregular migrants. Is that something that undermines national sovereignty, or is that something that provides safety and security for the entire community? So there's a split of opinion amongst the membership about how they feel about that, with another of other member states saying you must emphasize human rights principles and law first, and also recognize that even migrants, irrespective of their status, whether they're regular or irregular, still contribute widely to their new countries. The second issue they've been focusing on is how to address non-refugee migrants. And again, there is a separate global compact on refugees that's dealing specifically with that, and of course we have international migrants. But what to do with those people who are compelled to leave, for example, because of climate change or environmental degradation? And while it's clear that the membership doesn't want to create any new legal categories of human beings and their ensuing obligations, they're not quite clear on how this group of people should be addressed. So how does this relate to cities? Well, I think the first thing is that this type of labeling and distinction really doesn't play out so well at the city level. I think that cities provide services to people because cities are where people want to go work and live, irrespective of their migration status. And if you look at the draft text so far, there's already a number of objectives that have implications for the local level. For example, on access to services, on provision of legal identity or documentation, on providing safeguards for decent work, on fostering social inclusion and cohesion, and on finding ways to eliminate discrimination and promote a more fact-based discourse on migration. And while cities don't decide who comes in, they certainly decide how people are treated. So, it's up to cities to take the abstract global level about migration policy and to provide some type of realism or pragmatism to what they do, because they engage in the daily lives of individuals. And I think it's important to recall that people are members of a community first before they are members of a country. And I think in this way, cities have a responsibility in terms of engaging social inclusion and cohesion for a community. And I think maybe I'll come back later to talk more about other ways that cities can be involved.
Thank you very much, Amy. I think it would be really useful now if we could maybe hear from Linda a little bit about the city's perspective. So maybe you could tell us a bit about the migration profile of Los Angeles, the impacts, and the position of the city, bearing in mind the federal environment at the moment on migration.
Thank you so much, Alice, for having me, and thank you so much for being here. I'm really honored to be here. So my name is Linda Lopez. I work for Mayor Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles. I lead his Office of Immigrant Affairs, and there are offices like this all over the country now. But what we do is really focus on the integration of immigrants. Los Angeles is a global city, as you know. As Alice mentioned, about 39% of the population is foreign-born. We have more than 220 languages that are spoken in the city of Los Angeles. And we're home to large concentrations of people that have left their home countries and migrated to Los Angeles, whether it's Mexicans or whether it's a new Bangladeshi community. We have Little Ethiopia, and a lot of different ethnic enclaves that form part of the fabric of our city. And speaking to the issue of the role that cities play in terms of integration, in our city is essentially responsible for providing services to all residents, regardless of their immigration status. And one thing that we're really focused on lately is areas that have to do with civic participation. For example, how do people go through the naturalization process? How do they become citizens if they're eligible? Or how do they access the healthcare system? And we have projects that are directly focused on how to reach those populations. And the other underlying, I think, issue for us right now is that in the absence of federal immigration policy, unlike other countries that have a federal immigration plan, we don't really have that in the United States. And so a lot of our population that lives in the city also is impacted by this. But for us, the city is really a place where we welcome people from diverse places, and we are creating policies that really reflect how we're going to be able to provide those services for immigrants. Another area that we're really exploring more recently is entrepreneurship. You mentioned entrepreneurship. More than 40% of the small businesses that are opened in the city of Los Angeles are started by immigrants. And so for us, this is a great opportunity to also share information and knowledge to those populations on not only how to start a business, but also how to grow businesses. And so we've created a program, a project that's focused on financial education and financial literacy for individuals that don't necessarily have access to the financial mainstream. We are also focused on a project called Health for All, which is a project that allows for access for everyone, regardless of your immigration status. And we're creating policies that have to do with how do we work with our local law enforcement when it comes to all of the enforcement that's happening at the national level. And so we recently revised our Special Order 40, which is a policy that essentially prevents local law enforcement from asking people of their immigration status. Because one of the things we believe is that people need to feel safe regardless of your immigration status. And if you have that policy in place, that intervention, what happens is we have greater reporting mechanisms. So if you're a victim of a crime, you're more likely to report those crimes to local law enforcement. So there's a lot of different changes that are happening, I think, at the local level in terms of integration of immigrants around areas of civic participation, economic opportunity, health access, and at the same time, developing local policies in the absence of a federal immigration plan in these other areas, whether it's law enforcement or other kinds of policies that impact immigrant communities. The last thing I will say is that it's a nice segue that you mentioned the UN Global Compact, because increasingly cities are really doing the work at the local level and are really leading an agenda that focuses on immigrant and refugee integration at the local level. And in fact, Los Angeles, along with other cities, including New York, Atlanta, and others, are now starting to become more active in this process at the UN, at the global level. And so what you're really seeing is cities not only creating policies at the local level and programs at the local level, but also having a voice in that global realm, which I think is really exciting at this time, especially since the United States withdrew from the UN Global Compact on migration. We see this as an opportunity to really leverage the power of cities to be able to ask for a role in advocating for why local jurisdictions should be involved in these different aspects that you've mentioned around identification, around security, around language access, et cetera, because that's really where it's happening. It's really happening at the ground level, at the city level.
Thank you very much, Linda. So we have Antonia sitting here, who's from MasterCard. So I'm just thinking, our lovely audience is probably thinking, what exactly is MasterCard doing on migration? Why are you interested? And I guess, just for the benefit of the audience, she's going to talk about work right from refugee camps to cities. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a privilege to participate and to have MasterCard part of this panel. I see some people from MasterCard. I hope you know what we're doing for migrants. But let me begin briefly by saying what MasterCard actually does. So there's the common misperception that MasterCard is a credit card company, and that is not quite the case. We are a technology company that connects 2.5 billion consumers with 50 million retailers and businesses through digital payment transactions to drive global commerce. So with that insight, it becomes very clear why it's not just our responsibility, but very much in our interest to develop solutions and projects that help power inclusive economic growth, that help include more people in the formal economy, that essentially drive access to not just financial services, but economic opportunity globally, right? So with that in mind, if we think about the 65 million people displaced in the world right now, right? We do a lot of work with NGOs, with development organizations, with government as well, to try to bring our technology and services to better deliver aid and services to that population. So for example, one of the projects I'm very proud of personally is something we just launched this year with our friends at Power Africa and USAID, which is called the Smart Communities Coalition. And the basic focus here is on refugee camps in Africa. But if you think about refugee camps, right, they are designed to be temporary structures. They're often managed in a fairly siloed way. One agency will deal with clinics, another agency will deal with schools, and they'll build their own infrastructure. And what that means is that the refugee population and the host population around it don't necessarily have access to power and mobile connectivity and digital tools that'll allow them to become entrepreneurs, et cetera. So instead, with our friends at Power Africa and a coalition of some 20 public and private sector companies, we've decided that we're going to try to provision those basic essential services as you would in a city like LA, which is power and mobile connectivity and digital tools like identity and disbursement processes across an entire refugee camp. Because these camps have now been around for 10, 15 years, and they have more than 100,000 people in them. They are a city. With the intent, if we provide these basic services in a way that's commercially viable, can we increase the self-sufficiency of refugees? Very importantly, can we catalyze the economy of the host community around it, which is very poor? And can we make it easier for UN organizations and others to deliver the vital services to the refugee population, right? So that's an indication of using public-private partnerships, but also our technology and expertise to better serve this population. But how does this help a city like Los Angeles, right? So if we think about migrant populations in developed countries, one topic that's near and dear to our heart is financial inclusion. In order to be a part of the formal economy, have a job, get paid, start a business, et cetera, you should be financially included, you should have a bank account. Migrants face particular barriers around identification, et cetera. And so one of the things that we're doing is, again, working with NGOs and development organizations and people in the private sector is thinking through how can we build an identity for a migrant who doesn't necessarily have her original papers, so that when Antonia shows up in Greece, she's first registered by UNHCR in all likelihood, and then she goes to a camp that's run by the Red Cross, and then she migrates to Germany, and this local mayor wants to be able to see who she is to provide services. None of those systems talk to each other, right? And yet all of them should, because the delivery of services, where we have so few resources, need to do so much more, really depends on our ability to serve the individual and to track across organizations. So imagine a place where we have a sort of a globally interoperable standard for identity that organizations can choose to, if they want to share information, register people once and not multiple times, and most critically, locate the power of that identity with the migrant. So that when I rock up to Linda in LA and I say I want access to healthcare, I can choose to share with her the registration I've done at the UNHCR. But I choose not to, let's say, share a piece of information I shared with the Red Cross about my religious affiliation, because really that has nothing to do with this. Right? And so creating a identity that is shareable but owned by the migrant is for us super important, because of course from MasterCard's perspective, that's the first building block to getting to financial inclusion, getting a job, starting your business, right? And really becoming part of the financial and the social fabric of that local economy. So those are just some examples of MasterCard's approach.
Okay. Thank you,
I think
Antonia.
Dakota can talk a lot more about identity and the implications than I can.
I think you've perfectly teed up Dakota there. So Dakota, maybe you might tell us about ID 2020 and some of the principles that underpin it.
Sure, and I'll start where Antonia left off, because I think it's a perfect illustration of what it is we're trying to do. All too often we see that individuals lack access to the very, very basic fundamental services that all of us rely on because they're unable to prove their identity. Globally, over 1 billion people have no form of identification, so it's both migrants, but as many people just living within a country of residence. And identity is a prerequisite to get access to these services. Financial inclusion is sort of a particularly acute case because there are regulations dictating what it is you need to show to get access to those financial services. But similarly, if you try and enroll your kid in primary school and you don't have any proof that they're from that, that area or eligible to go to the school, you risk having that child being able to get an education. If we think about smart cities, just sort of jumping to the theme of the conference broadly, this becomes even sort of more obvious, the need for digital identity. As we digitize all of our services, we're all living in sort of a mixed physical and digital world, and we need a way to prove who we are both offline and online. And so we can't rely on the sort of historical paper-based systems that have provided identity credentials to date. And I think more fundamentally, and Antonia hit upon this as well, but the ability to prove your identity is a basic and universal human right. And it's one that we haven't necessarily thought of as a universal human right, but when we think about it in that way, we have to think quite carefully about how we afford access to that right to truly everybody. I think that an important thing is that our current models of digital identity don't work for anyone. Digital identity is used today, sort of evolved pretty awkwardly and ad hoc from the paper-based systems that we've used to date. And so, in the earliest days, we relied on face-to-face transactions. At some point, wax seals. Eventually, ID cards. And what we've tried to do in developing digital identity systems is often just to digitize those same processes and protocols. But the internet sort of changes everything, right? Suddenly you're transacting on a global level. People are moving around. Certainly, as we're talking about today, migration changes. You're removed from the communities that could sort of attest to your identity. There's a famous New Yorker cartoon that I think came out in 1993 that said, "On the internet, no one knows that you're a dog." And I think there's actually something really true of that. Is that we need a trusted way to prove who we are as we transact online and increasingly as we transact in the physical world, but using digital processes. And so I just want to impress upon you that digital identity is incredibly, incredibly important for achieving everything that the three panelists before have talked about. But digital identity systems carry significant risk if they're not thoughtfully designed and carefully implemented. And we can't underestimate the risks of data misuse or abuse. There's sort of two ways, I think, to illustrate that. And the first is the risk of exclusion. So this was the point I was talking about ensuring that everybody truly does have this right. For some, including refugees and marginalized populations, reliance on national ID programs simply isn't viable. We need to provide an alternative for those individuals. They need a way to be able to prove who they are in a trusted and verifiable way. And as Antonia said, be able to permission that data very selectively and carefully where they carry the information with them. Imagine the scenario of somebody, as Antonia described, fleeing across the border. They maybe don't have time to collect all of their documentation. Maybe they decide that it's actually dangerous to have that on their person, and yet they need a way to prove when they arrive in the host country that they are who they say they are. And so if identity systems are bound by the borders of nation states, of NGOs, of agencies, the identity that we've provided somebody is actually of limited use. Right when it's needed most. So you need portability, you need this interoperability, and you need user control and sort of multiple different identities that people are able to use to prove they are. And then there's the risk of misuse, and I'll actually bring this one very local. Many of you are probably familiar with the story of the New York City ID program. This was launched in 2015 to provide much needed identity credentials for the over 1 million, estimated 1 million undocumented immigrants here in New York City. And the focus was specifically on providing an alternative. So it sort of meets that first threshold of saying, we need to provide people with an alternative if registration with one authority is not safe. 1 in 8 New York City residents now has a New York City ID. And all of this information is stored on a database someplace here in the city, which has, I think, 400,000 foreign passports, 400,000 driving licenses, thousands of birth certificates, et cetera. All of that information would prove tremendously risky for those individuals if it got into the hands of somebody who didn't want to provide sanctuary to those individuals. Mayor de Blasio has vowed to protect the database, There's currently a lawsuit pending about whether that data could be shared. And so as we think about sort of the risks of how we design these systems, if we, even if we trust our government in any context now, building large centralized databases of identity information can prove tremendously risky as administrations turn or as politics turn. And so what's critical here is that we can't just focus on centralized solutions. We need to figure out how we provide that user control where individuals truly do own their own information and provide privacy.
Thank you very much, Dakota. So I'm very conscious we're at a Smart Cities conference, so it would be really useful if we could discuss amongst the panelists just some of the solutions that are being employed, the tech that underpins that, the networks and partnerships that enable that. And maybe if I could start with Linda, from the city's perspective, what have you been doing on the solution space, and what tech underpins it, and who are you working with to make it happen?
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question. So one of the things that we've been really focused on is how to create public-private partnerships, because one of the things that I think we've learned is that government really can't do it alone, and that when you think about innovative solutions to challenging problems, that we do need to have a way to create those partnerships. And I'll give you one example of a partnership that we recently created, and maybe two examples, but one example that we're really proud of is right now in this moment in time, a lot of immigrants are fearing being deported from the United States, and that's a consequence of federal policy that has been created around enforcement. And so local jurisdictions across the country are facing this big challenge of what do you do with these populations that contribute to the economy in the form of taxes, and LA is a good example of that. We're the 16th largest economy. We're very diverse, as I mentioned, so there's a lot going on in terms of what these immigrants face, especially at the local level. And as a consequence to that, one of the things that we started to do is to think about what are some of the basic human rights that people should have with respect to when they're facing these challenges of potentially being deported from the United States and separating those families. And so one of the things that we did was we created a fund, which is essentially pooling funding from city, the county, and local philanthropy to provide access to legal services or screenings even for people who are asylum seekers or people who are victims of human trafficking or people who are victims of domestic violence who are eligible to permanently stay in the United States through a T visa or a U visa, and also to be able to allow for this conversation really around, what is a proper balance of what the role of government should be in affirmatively providing those kinds of services. So it's a $10 million fund. It's a legal justice fund that other cities are now pursuing as a way to provide those services. And for us, it's really important to also utilize data and metrics to evaluate the outcomes of that project. And so we're partnering with the Vera Institute as a way to document and to assess those cases and the individuals that are being represented. The second thing is around financial services and financial inclusion. For us, that's really important also, especially for the immigrant populations that we work with. So we partnered with the Mexican consulate actually to create what's called a financial window at the consulate, where individuals of Mexican origin or anybody really can go to obtain one-on-one financial counseling with experts. If they're interested in opening up bank accounts, that's fine, but the idea is to provide that information so that people are well aware of what it means to be a part of the financial mainstream. So those are two examples of some of the work that we're doing with the private sector and of course government.
Thank you. As you mentioned the private sector there, I'm thinking of Antonia, who's sitting beside you. Do you want to maybe talk about one of the examples you talked about earlier, Antonia, and how you actually made it happen?
Right, so I think from our perspective, as we're building public-private partnerships, what we've learned over the last couple of years is to really find the intersection of interest between what the private sector wants to achieve, right? What the public sector needs to achieve, what the end user, most importantly, the resident, the migrant, the citizen needs to achieve. And so I think the Smart Communities Coalition is actually a good example of that, where we've had a great relationship with USAID for a long time, but we'd never really found a topic that really, where we all connected. And then we did a lot of work in these very established refugee camps and sort of just immediately understood the overlap. So that Power Africa have just been fantastic partners. We've got more than 20 other organizations from Microsoft and Accenture to World Vision, et cetera, rallying around this, right? And in such a way that we really believe that this is not a philanthropic effort for us. Philanthropy is wonderful and it's catalytic and it's great, but it's not scalable. What happens when the grant runs out, my boss likes to say. So instead, what you need to find is commercially viable opportunities. Now, if you have a city of 200,000, happens to be a refugee camp, and a surrounding host community, all of a sudden really interesting providers, whether it's solar home solutions, power providers, right? Mobile connectivity providers, even banks that would traditionally not necessarily target that part of the consumer segment, now being interested because of the sheer scale of it. Everybody's coming together and saying, you know what, this is really not just a valuable service to the user. We can believe that this is scalable and viable over the longer term. So for me, it's all about how much we as MasterCard have learned through this process of collaboration and co-creation, and about the importance of having that very open dialogue about what are the pain points and the interests that we all, mutually have, so that we can come together and move very quickly and very efficiently to actually getting stuff done on the ground. So I think that for us is a very important learning, and really a testament to the power of working with, whether it's the UN organization and local government, NGO partners, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. And Dakota, how did you make ID 2020 work?
Sure. So clearly we've been working with MasterCard because many of the values that were just described are sort of central to the way that we work. ID 2020 is a public-private partnership where all of the alliance partners have come together with a shared commitment to improving lives through digital identity. We sort of say we're willing to wrestle with all of these very hard questions and pursue an ethics-based, user-based approach to how we implement digital identity. And there's sort of two main thrusts to the work that's done by alliance partners. The first is rolling out pilot projects, implementing pilot projects, building the necessary evidence base to demonstrate to policymakers, to demonstrate to companies, to prove to the MasterCards of the world that there is a viable business model in doing this in a thoughtful and user-centric way. And the second bit is setting those technical standards for interoperability. So working with a host of organizations such that interoperability is something that is actually viable. And the organization we count, Microsoft, Accenture, UNHCR, Gavi, all as partners, and the organization as well as many more. But what's I think really important is that it really is about governance. And sort of the core of what we do is how do we create a neutral platform for organizations to bring new technology innovations to bear, to understand whether or not there's relevance to that technology, but perhaps most importantly to ensure that we're embedding ethics into everything we do. The organization is structured very much as an active alliance. So there's a very small team of us here in New York City, but each of our partners contribute in kind, financially, such that we're creating a sort of a cohesive manner for these organizations to pursue a sort of better model of digital identity.
Thank you, Dakota. So, Amy, we started with you, and now we're going back to you. So, bearing all that you've heard in terms of the impact on cities, the solutions that's being employed, and the work that you're doing in preparation of the global compacts, how can cities get involved? How can the private sector get involved? How can civil society get involved in what you're doing?
Well, I think while migration is new for the UN, it isn't new at all for cities, for the private sector, for civil society organizations. I think the UN has a lot to learn from all of these potential partnerships. And because it's so new in the UN, we haven't yet really engaged well with all of these other actors from who we can draw from. And sharing a lot of the good and bad practices would be helpful. The way civil society, the way city governments, the way the private sector can kind of challenge and change the narrative, really challenge a lot of the negative discourse that we hear against migrants and refugees would be important to hear. For example, providing access to services to all people, irrespective of their status. Is that really a drain on the resources, or is that a way of providing safety and security and promoting social cohesion for all? So I think there's a couple of different ways that they can really be engaged. I think the private sector in particular, they, strictly from their own employment of people, when they are not able to fill those labor gaps within a national context and they need to look for certain skill sets abroad, they can have a huge influence on a nation's migration policy and should have avenues in which to do that. Secondly, the private sector, cities, as well as CSOs are already carrying out a number of initiatives that are helpful and interesting for the UN to learn from. So I would suggest two things in particular. As I said, almost all of the governments of the UN are negotiating this text at the UN. And so they all have permanent missions here. And I specifically, a call out for those representatives from other countries to be in contact with your permanent mission here, find out what it is precisely their stances, their national stances, and see what kind of information or support you can provide to them. And secondly, I would also like to highlight that when this global compact is adopted in Marrakesh, it is not the end of something, it is the beginning of something. So that would be a fantastic forum for a lot of you to come and to look at the global compact that was adopted and say, we're going to focus on these particular issues, on legal identity, on provision of access to services, on combating discrimination. And we want to partner with others, partners with parts of the UN to launch some type of initiative to kind of really give life and energize this global compact, because even though it's going to be adopted by all of our heads of state and government, it's really at the local level where it gets energized and it actually has legs and it's implemented.
Thank you very much, Amy. So I'm conscious that we have very limited time. We've heard a call to action from Amy for everyone to get involved. But before we draw the session to a close, I'd be really interested to hear your one-liner in terms of what is your key message to the audience here today in relation to migration and its impact on cities. So maybe I'll start with Dakota.
Sure. So I think, not sure if this is working. There we go. My one-liner would be simply that for migration to be done in a way that's respectful of individuals' rights, that provides them with access to so many of the necessary services, and truly does empower the individual, we really do need to think about digital identity, and we need to think about it at a global level. Of course, implementation and sort of uptake is done at a local level, but there's sort of a mechanism for us to come together and collaborate on something that's just such a fundamental building block for migration globally.
Antonia?
So for me, it's about stressing the importance of collaboration and co-creation, which I think we've all talked about now. And not just convening, actually rolling up your sleeves and going to co-create something, because I think the very pressing challenges we face with migration really can only be solved if we work together and tackle it together.
Linda?
I would say, for me, having now been in the public sector for more than 5 years, working for Mayor Garcetti, that now is the time for us to create multi-sector coalitions with stakeholders that haven't necessarily traditionally been in this particular space. And that means that potentially, or hopefully, private sector involvement, greater engagement by the private sector around these issues, because it's going to impact your bottom line in the end.
And Amy?
I would just like to compare this global migration compact process to the Paris Agreement on climate change, because when it was adopted a couple of years ago, it wasn't just governments that agreed to it. We all agreed to it to some extent, at the city level, the state level, communities themselves. So I think what we're trying to do with the Migration Global Compact is to bring it out to you so that you adopt it too and you hold your governments accountable for the commitments they make there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you very much, Linda, Antonia, and Dakota. I think we very clearly heard that if we're going to address the issue successfully of migration and its impact on cities, we need greater public-private collaboration. And in terms of the global compacts, there's an opportunity for cities, the private sector, civil society to be totally involved in the process. So thank you very much. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Ban Ki-moon. He said, the previous Secretary General, of course, of the United Nations, Migration is an expression of human aspiration for dignity, safety, and a better future. It is a part of the social fabric, part of our very makeup as a human family. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Alice.